Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled USDA's Grant Funding for Broadband and Telecom, Community Connect and Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Programs. Our presenters for today's program are Randall Millhiser and Scott Steiner, both with the USDA Rural Development Rural Utility Service. My name is Randy Evans. I am an attorney in private practice based in Phoenix, Arizona. I am also the Advisory Council Chair of the TribalTelecom and Technology Conference, and it's my privilege to be your host for today's program. Before we jump into the program today, I wanted to take just a couple minutes and talk about the TribalTelecom Conference. TribalTelecom exists to make information and communications technologies accessible to American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. These webinars, which have been going now for a couple months, are intended to supplement the topics and themes that are addressed at the annual TribalTelecom Conference and to bring year-round learning opportunities to assist tribes in forging their own pathways across the digital divide. Our fourth annual TribalTelecom Conference is coming up in May of 2015, May 4th through 7th. It will be held in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I'll provide a little bit more details about the conference at the end of today's program. You can also find information online at TribalTelecomConference.com. Today's program is going to run right at exactly an hour. Following this introduction, we will have about a 20-minute program on the Community Connect grant, and then about a 20-minute program on the distance learning and telemedicine programs, and then we'll have a question and answer period following the formal presentations. If you do have questions during the program, you can use the question box on the GoToWebinar toolbar, and those will come in to, I'll see those and I will present those to Scott and Randall at the end of the program. And we would ask that you make your questions short and specific so we can get to as many as possible. We're very pleased to have Scott and Randall presenting today. Scott is an engineering branch chief with the Loan Origination and Approval Division with Rural Utility Service. Scott joined USDA RUS in the Telecom Division in August of 2004. He came on board as a staff engineer in the Broadband Division of the RUS Telecom program and worked in that capacity until becoming an engineering branch chief in 2012 to assist with the great increase in servicing volume experienced as part of the Broadband Initiatives program under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, or ARRA, before being reassigned to the position of engineering branch chief for the Loan Origination and Approval Division as part of RUS Telecom's recent reorganization. Randall Millhiser is a field step branch chief with the Loan Origination and Approval Division. Randall joined USDA RUS Telecom Division in 2009, moving over to federal government work following a long career in the business private sector. Randall brings over 25 years experience as a chief financial officer for several closely held corporations. He has an extensive knowledge of critical financial analysis, a thorough understanding of complex financial statements and pro forma projections, and is well versed in the complexities of intercompany financial relationships. He has a BSBA in accounting from East Carolina University. We're very privileged to have both these gentlemen, and we thank you for taking time, Scott and Randall, to present these very important topics today. With that introduction, I'll turn it over to Scott, who's going to talk about the Community Connect grant program.
Thank you, Randy. So that is my information. There is contact information that's available in these slides. So as Randy mentioned, we'll get to the questions at the end. If there are anything that we don't get time to answer during this webinar, or something that you don't want to ask in front of a large group, please feel free to reach out to us on the information that's available on these slides. If you could advance to the next slide. So as background, the Community Connect grant program was created in 2002. It's a competitive grant program. The Regulation is 7 CFR 1739, which was updated on May 3rd, 2013. Introduced some changes from past years. Those changes remain in effect. There's a notice of funds availability, tends to set forth the minimum and maximum grant amounts for the fiscal year. The most recent NOFA was for this past year. It was published May 22nd of 2014. That program has concluded. We are looking to do a notice of solicitation of funds for fiscal year 2015, and you'll notice in November of 2014. So coming right up. I don't have a super definitive time frame on that, but we expect it will be quite soon. Next slide, please. In terms of funding levels in recent years, it's shifted around quite a bit, but you see somewhere in the $10 to $25 million range typically. I don't know exactly what funding level we're looking at for this coming fiscal year, and in fact that won't be really firmed up at the time of applications, but expect it to be somewhere in this ballpark, low tens of millions of dollars. Next slide, please. So program rules and eligibility. You can go to the next slide. Eligible applicants. These are the types of entities who can apply for a grant. So an incorporated organization, an Indian tribe or tribal organization as defined, a state or local unit of government, or a cooperative private corporation or limited liability company organized on a for-profit or not-for-profit basis. Individuals and partnerships are not eligible. And the last sentence here, applicants must have the legal capacity and authority to apply for funding and enter into a contract with RUS. So we can accept any of these entity types. We do occasionally run into with some governmental entities, in particular, that there may be some state or local law that prevents them from operating a telecom system or contracting with us. And so that's not something where we're specifically making them ineligible. It's their entity type that does that. But most entity types, other than individuals and partnerships, are eligible to apply under the program. Next slide, please. In terms of an eligible project, the project must serve a proposed funded service area in which broadband service doesn't exist, and these capital items I'll get to with definitions on next slides. Offer service at the broadband grant speed to all residents and business customers within the PFSA. Offer free service at the broadband grant speed to all critical community facilities located within the PFSA for at least 2 years, starting from the time service becomes available to each CCF. And provide a community center with at least 2 computer access points and wireless access at the broadband grant speed free of all charges to users for at least 2 years. The center must be open and accessible to area residents before, during, and after normal working hours and on Saturday and or Sunday. Next slide, please. So the proposed funded service area means a contiguous geographic area in which, in a rural area in which the applicant proposes to provide service at the broadband grant speed. There's a definition that's up here. If you go to our website, which a link is provided in this presentation, there's actually a link to a mapping tool which will show what this looks like on a map. If you go to that site, then it's the area that shows up as a kind of transparent pink layer. So in terms of areas that are rural, it's areas that are not located within a city, town, or incorporated area that has a population greater than 20,000 inhabitants, or an urbanized area contiguous and adjacent to a city or town that has a population of greater than 50,000 inhabitants. So, like I say, it's somewhat of a mouthful, but you can visually see it pretty easily on our website. Can you move to the next slide, please? In terms of broadband service definitions, broadband service means any terrestrial technology having the capacity to provide transmission facilities that enable subscribers of the service to originate and receive high-quality voice data and graphics. And it's defined at a minimum rate of 3 megabits per second upload plus down for both fixed and mobile. And when we say 3 megabits per second upload plus down, we mean provisioned however the service provider does it. So if it's 2 down, 1 up, that adds up to 3, and that qualifies for that purpose. 1.5 megabits per second symmetrically. We don't count T1s in that private circuit kind of thing. And then the broadband grant speed is a minimum bandwidth of 5 megabits per second, download plus upload the same way, that the applicant must propose to deliver to every customer in the PFSA that's being applied for. Next slide, please. So for eligible grant purposes, the construction, acquisition, or leasing of facilities used to deploy service at the broadband grant speed to all residents and businesses in the PFSA. Buildings constructed with grant funds must reside on property owned by the awardee, and leasing costs, to the extent that we can pay them, will only be covered through the advance of funds period included in the award documents, which is 3 years. Next slide, please. The next purpose is the improvement, expansion, construction, or acquisition of a community center and provision of computer access points. There is a limit on the amount that can be directed towards this purpose. That limit is 10% of the requested grant amount, or $150,000, whichever is less. If the community center is constructed with grant funds, it follows into the rule that was mentioned on the previous slide. That property must be owned by the awardee, and we can include funding for at least 2 and up to 10 computer access points available in that community center. The next eligible purpose is the cost of providing the necessary bandwidth for service free of charge to the critical community facilities for 2 years. It was specified in the NOFA for last year. I don't think these limits are going to change. The minimum of grant amount is $100,000. The maximum grant amount that can be applied for as a single grant is $3 million. Next slide, please. For ineligible grant purposes, funds may not be used to finance the duplication of any existing broadband service provided by other entities, and so when it's mentioned that broadband service can't be available in the area, that's what this point is getting to. And a change from the past that was introduced 2 fiscal years ago, operating expenses are ineligible with the exception of lease costs for facilities to deploy broadband service and those bandwidth expenses for providing service to the CCFs. Next slide, please. There is a matching contribution as part of these projects, and so the applicant must provide a matching contribution which is at least 15% of the total financial assistance being requested. Matching funds cannot include any financial assistance from federal sources unless there is a federal statutory exception. If such an exception exists, evidence should be provided in the application. You see that from time to time. Just make sure to highlight that out if you were looking to use such funds. At the time of the closing of the award, the awardee must contribute or demonstrate available cash reserves in an account of the awardee equal to at least that 15% of the grant. The matching contribution must be in the form of cash to be used to fund operations of the project. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through each of these. If you go to our website, you'll see the elements of a complete application, and I just put this up there to highlight that we're looking for a number of things as part of a responsive application. You'd be surprised the number of times people leave out one or sometimes all of these, except for the 424. If you could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of scoring, it's scored on a basis of 100 points. It's broken into 3 scoring components: the PFSA challenges, where up to 50 points are available, local participation up to 40 points, and management experience up to 10 points. And introduced in last fiscal year's program and to be continued again this year, this program is not covered by SUTA provisions specifically which modify grant terms, but there was a scoring element that was introduced that makes 15 points available if the PFSA contains what is called a special consideration area, so tribal or tribal jurisdictional areas. Next slide, please. So in making the final selection between applications, there's actually a series of tiebreakers is what this boils down to. So persistent poverty counties that will be served within the PFSA, out-migration communities that will be served within the PFSA, the rurality of the PFSA, the speed of broadband service that is offered to subscribers in the PFSA, SUDA areas that are within the PFSA, and community members with disabilities that will be served within the PFSA. So these are all things that the administrator can take into account to decide between applications that happen to tie. We can move to the next slide. Common mistakes with applications. Insufficient match funding or documentation of that funding is a very big mistake that people make. Elements of a complete application are omitted or include too little detail. We have to make sure that these awards meet the requirements specified in the regulation, and if that information is left off, we can't tell whether those requirements are met, whether the project is technically or financially feasible. Applicants will sometimes include insufficient or no historical financials. That is definitely a problem that gets some applicants in trouble. Inadequate or no financial assumptions included, so we're looking at for the financial feasibility of the project, and if we just have some very bare bones pro formas that don't have any explanation of how those numbers were arrived at, it's hard to be very comfortable with that. Lack of details on the community center, where it is located, who owns the property, the hours, a little hard to see on the presentation, but that's bolded, number of stations, access and availability of the public, and what service will be offered in it. So offering service that's available to the public and free at the community center is a specific eligibility criteria, and so applications need to go into some detail to make sure that we have the comfort level that the eligibility requirements are being taken into account. And why I highlight the hours is that that's a very common thing that people leave off, that they don't mention specifically. And on a past slide, it was indicated that the community center needs to be open before, during, and after normal business hours and on Saturday and or Sunday. And so if we don't know if that's happening, we don't know if the project is eligible. It doesn't need to be open like that every day. You can stagger schedules, but you need to make it available for people who, if they are working on a fixed schedule, they're not excluded simply by always being at work when the community center is open. There is a mapping tool, and so if the proposed funded service area on that mapping tool does not match the PFSA described in the application, or if there is the mapping tool provides a reference number where we can pull that map up, if that's not provided, that's an incomplete application and won't be eligible. If the entire PFSA is not rural, that is ineligible. All premises in the service area need to be offered service at the broadband grant speed, so occasionally we'll see applications that specifically choose to serve a particular entity type. It needs to be available to anybody who wishes to subscribe. And insufficient documentation on scoring elements is a mistake. It's not an eligibility mistake, but if you don't highlight the ways in which your application you feel should score well, then there may be disagreement on our end, and you may not score as high and consequently not get an award you might otherwise have. And next slide, please. This is the contact information, and so if you call this phone number or send an email address to that email box, we will get back to you with any questions that come up, either that you don't want to ask here or anything that comes to you over the course of the next few weeks or any time, really. And with that, next slide, I will turn it over to Randall to talk about the DLT program.
Okay, thank you, Scott. My name is Randall Millhiser. I'm with the Loan Origination and Approval Division, just like Scott is. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program. The Distance Learning and Telemedicine, commonly referred to as DLT, also does have its own email address, which we'll list at the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions or follow-up comments, you can email that address, and we'll respond to them. But the Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program is a grant program designed to improve distance learning services or telemedicine services in rural America by assisting learning facilities or medical facilities to establish a telecommunications link from a hub to an end-user site or sites through the use of eligible equipment to transmit audio, video, or other formats for the purpose of education or the exchange of healthcare information. Now that's quite a mouthful, but we will emphasize the second part of that slide, which it says telecommunications link from a hub to an end-user site or sites through the use of eligible equipment to transmit audio, video, or other formats for the purpose of education or the exchange of healthcare information. Okay, next slide, please. And we'll drill down on the definitions a little further. Distance learning means a telecommunications link to an end user through the use of eligible equipment to, one, provide educational programs, instruction, or information originating in one area, i.e. that's the hub, whether rural or not, to students and teachers who are located in rural areas, or those would be the insights, or two, to connect teachers and students located in one rural area with teachers and students that are located in a different rural area. So one of the things I would point out about this slide is on the first part of the definition, it talks about provide educational programs, instructions, or information originating in one area, whether rural or not. So the hub does not necessarily have to be in a rural area. Next slide, please. Now, telemedicine means a telecommunications link to an end user through the use of eligible equipment, which electronically links medical professionals at separate sites in order to exchange healthcare information in audio, video, graphic, or other format for the purpose of providing improved healthcare services, primarily to residents of rural areas. Okay, please notice that, I mean, this is a program designed to improve learning and telecommunications to rural areas. So the word rural pops up a lot. Next slide, please. Okay, 1703.103 says an applicant eligibility and allocation of funds. So the applicant must be a legal organized as an incorporated organization or partnership, an Indian tribe or tribal organization, a state or local unit of government, a consortium as defined in 1703.102, or other legal entity, including a private corporation organized on a for-profit or not-for-profit basis. Now, one note on this applicant eligibility is that electric or telecommunication borrowers are not eligible. Next slide, please. Now, the DLT, we'll talk about some of the basics. The NOSA, we're not quite sure when it's going to be announced, but we're expecting it to be announced in early 2015. The funding level in 2014 was $20.3 million, and similar to Scott's Community Connect grant program, that the dollar amounts vary from year to year, but I think it's usually somewhere around between 17 and 20 million. Now, the minimum grant amount is $50,000, and the maximum grant amount is $500,000. And only grants are available. No loans or combo loan grants are available. Next slide, please. Now, on the DLT grant program, you have to provide matching funds, and you're required to have at least a 15% minimum match. Now, this is a competitive program, and different but the minimum, which is 15%, carries no points. Now, please note that this does not fund transmission facilities, salaries, or operating costs, or building construction, or vehicles. Next slide, please. Now, our scoring is a little more complicated. There are 3 objective sections and 5 subjective sections. On the objective, you have a rurality of the project, which score up to 45 points. The economic need based on the National School Lunch Program, which is up to 35 points. And then you can get extra points for matching funds. So the more funds you can match or contribute to the project, the more points you will get, up to 35 points. Like I mentioned before, the 15% match that you're required to be eligible does not carry any points. Now, there are 5 subjective areas. Now, you can get extra points for the NSLP if you determine that your NSLP is below 50%. This might apply especially in the telemedicine area if you're doing something like a home nurses situation or something like that, where the national school lunch is not a good benchmark for the need for the program. Then you have some narratives you have to submit. One is a need for services and project benefits. Then the innovativeness, cost effectiveness, and then special consideration, which we will talk about in a couple of slides. Next slide, please. Now, the best source of information is to go to our website and to get the DLT application guide and toolkit. This is a picture of the 2014 application guide. We don't have the 2015 one written yet, but it will be updated and posted to the website by the time the notice comes out. Next slide, please. This is just a snapshot of the web page. If you go to the Rural Development web page and go click on Utilities, you can go over to the Distance Learning and Telemedicine program on the right, and then you can access all these resources from the web page itself. I would recommend that you do that. If you're thinking about applying, you could go there and download the 2014 application guide and toolkit so you can get familiar with the application process and the forms that are required to be submitted. And then the 2015 guide and toolkit will not be very much different, so you'll have a pretty good understanding. Plus, it will give you a chance to read it, and if you have any questions, you could email me some questions about it, and I could help clarify those for you. Okay, next slide. Now, there is no pseudo provision for this program, but there is what we call special consideration. Special consideration is designed for projects that contain at least one end-user site within a trust area or a tribal jurisdictional area, and you will get 15 extra points if you can document that. Next slide, please. Now, to get special consideration, you really only have to have one of your end sites in one of these areas. And you can document this in one of these 3 ways. You can do it with a map that the end-user site is within the boundaries of the trust area or tribal jurisdictional area, or you can have a map identifying the geographical coordinates and physical address of the end-user site, or 3, with some form of legal reference or written evidence that the area where the end-user site is located is a trust area or tribal jurisdictional area. But when you apply for the special consideration, you do have to document this. If it's not documented, then it will not be counted. Next slide, please. Now, to show the significance of the special consideration, of the 65 awards that received FY14 funding, 29 were applicants that applied for and received the special consideration points. Now, the 15 points in this competitive program, 15 points is a lot. So if you have the ability to apply for this and you can document it, by all means, I recommend that you do that. Next slide. Okay, when you apply, you have to have a host organization, which is the legally established incorporated entity that assumes full authority and responsibility for the grant. This is the person that's going to sign the documents and be legally bound to the project. Now, the project usually consists of multiple organizations. The lead organization takes on the role of a host. The other organizations are simply stated participants, often forming a consortium. Next slide. Consortiums are often put together for the purpose of the DLT project, but they must have a legal existence and registration at the outset to be an official applicant. Otherwise, they are just informal arrangements. And in the case of informal arrangements, one lead organization must step forward as the host organization to sign the application and to sign all the grant documents following the award. Next slide. Okay, DLT regulations list eligible costs to be organized into 3 categories. Number 1, eligible equipment and operating software. By far the most prominent use of funds. About 90% or more of the grant funds are used. Now, this is an equipment-based grant. This is not for construction. So that's why all of the money is used for the purchase and the use of the equipment. 2, the instructional programming, first-time acquisition of instructional programming that is a capital asset. Renewals of instructional programming are not eligible. And number 3, which is the smallest category, is technical assistance and instructions for using eligible equipment. The category also includes systems integration services or needed system engineering studies. Category 3 costs are limited to 10% of the grant request. So if you have a lot of items in this category, once we determine that it's you've reached your 10%, items over the 10% will be eliminated. Next slide, please. So some more basic. Eligible equipment and operating software is restricted to on-premises and user interface functionality only, as opposed to equipment or hardware used in transmission. Again, I emphasize that this is an equipment-based grant program. The DLT regulations list of eligible equipment: computer hardware and software, audio and video equipment, computer network components, terminal equipment, data terminal equipment, interactive audio, video equipment, original equipment manufacturer or OEM authorized warranties on eligible equipment up to a 3-year life of the grant, and inside wiring. Now, we like to see the warranties included as the cost of the equipment. In other words, when you submit your list of equipment that's going to be used, if you have a piece of equipment, it should say, read to the effect of XYZ equipment with included warranty. Next slide. An example of computer hardware and software, will it be used as end user or hub equipment to communicate between 2 or more video endpoints for the purposes of overcoming the barriers of distance in the context of distance learning or telemedicine. So this is the word distance here is very important. You remember you have to have a hub and an end site, so you're trying to overcome the distance barriers of communication between the 2 points. Now, one question is, will it be used for an in-house medical database or just within a local area network such as a campus? If so, the same computer hardware and software would not be eligible. Next slide. The list of eligible equipment would more likely include an example of these items: hub equipment, which is a video bridge, communication server, firewall, transversal server, content multimedia server. And the end user equipment would be video teleconferencing desktop units on portable carts or wall-mounted, iPads, laptops, telepresence units with digital exam input and devices, software virtualization programs running on standard desktop computers. You have to remember to try to envision a teacher in a student scenario. You have to imagine the teacher being in a classroom at maybe a university, and the students being at community centers or local areas away from the, out in the county or the community, and they're trying to communicate with each other in a live presence. The same thing as doctors. You want to imagine like a doctor and a patient relationship, where a doctor is in one area and a nurse is at a clinic in another location. Next slide, please. The Project Reality Score is one of the DLT's program eligibility factors. The overall reality score must be at least 20 points to be eligible, and we'll go over the next points in a minute. But the reality score is based on the population of a settled area as determined in the latest U.S. Census 2010 census. Just remember, we do not count hubs when we determine the rurality. Next slide, please. So if you have a hub and 4 or 5 insights, you can determine the rurality. You're going to list each insight, and then you're going to put the rurality points next to each one. And then they're simply added up and divided to get an average score. But your hub is not counted unless your hub is also serving as an insight. So as you can see, 5,000 or fewer certainly carries the most points. And then once you get over 20,000, it carries no points. Next slide, please. A couple of housekeeping points to make. Before you apply, be sure you have your DUNS number. And most people are familiar with a DUNS number at this point, and most applicants will already have that. There is a link here that shows you where to apply for it. But one thing that's kind of new is the systems for award management registration, or the SAM registration. You also have to have this registration number prior to applying. And there's a link there. And it doesn't take that long to get your SAM registration number, but just please be sure you have this before you apply. Next slide. There are 2 ways to apply. You can apply through grants.gov, or you can apply in a hard copy with 3 binders. You can send in 1 original and 2 copies. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the NOSA is expected to be out in early 2015. Next slide, please. This is contact information. This is the DLT email address. If you have a question, you can just email us directly, and I will check the DLT email and send you a response. And I believe that concludes our webinar.
Great. Thank you, Randall, and thank you, Scott. And we've got quite a few questions here, and so we're just going to take these in order and go through as many of these as possible. And let's start off with the Community Connect questions. So, Scott, these would be for you, but either one of you can jump in. So the first question is, can a tribe qualify to have the matching requirement waived for the distance learning and telemedicine grant programs? Actually, I guess, Randall, that's more of a question for you.
We cannot waive the 15% match. That is a regulation requirement, and we have to have that. So even to be eligible to apply, you have to have at least the 15% cash matching funds.
Okay. And then there's a related question here that is that's for the Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program. What are some examples of in-kind support that are allowed if operating costs and salaries are not covered by the grant?
Well, we do allow, if sometimes some of the vendors will submit, donate some of the equipment, which would be considered in-kind match. But the equipment that is donated or for the grant purposes must be a line item in the budget by itself. And it must be at the, it can be discounted. It has to be at the fair market value, and it has to have the appropriate support documentation from the vendor that they're going to donate this equipment.
Okay, and then so that's actually, I think, in part answers a follow-up question that's asked: is can part of the match be in kind, or must it be coming in the form of cash?
No, it can be, part of it can be in kind.
Okay.
And
then
the application guide goes into that in much more detail. So, and also I think the toolkit also specifies that in some of the worksheets. Okay.
And then another question on with the costs and the grant amount is, does the $500,000 maximum include any indirect cost in that, or are all indirect costs excluded?
Well, I'm not sure I know the answer to that one. You'd have to send me that on an email and let me respond to that.
Okay. And then jumping back to the Community Connect, then question here is, would video equipment be eligible for community centers as part of the Community Connect grant?
It's not really a primary purpose of it. I think we could probably get into funding some of it in an incidental way. If it were a large portion of what was being funded, then it could be an issue.
Yeah, okay. And actually, a related question to that is if you could just kind of real quickly summarize the basics of what would be considered applicable equipment.
For Community Connect?
For Community.
The vast majority of the cost for Community Connect, unlike DLT, Community Connect is an infrastructure program that is for building out the facilities for providing that broadband service in the area that's applied for. And so that's really most of what we're looking for. And then you're operating the community center, so the equipment costs, so the minimum of 2, at most 10 computer terminals, the furniture, yeah, those sorts of costs.
Okay. And then a specific question on that note with the Community Connect is whether the Community Connect Fund grant can be used for telemedicine services.
Well, that isn't the primary focus of it. And so I think that you could start getting into trouble if the costs for that start creeping up. I think like a small amount of video conferencing equipment we have funded in the past. If you start talking about DLT or distance learning end-user sites that are deployed all over the place, then I imagine that could start becoming problematic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then a couple questions about assistance with the application process itself. And so start with a specific question, and that is if the application process, and this question came in during the Community Connect portion of the program, so I assume that that's what they're talking about, but does the application process allow for the local management team, the applicant, to present a plan to the USDA and have some type of a meeting or conference call or consultation to address any questions about the proposal that they're looking to submit?
It is a competitive program, and so the contact information that I provided, we're available during regular business hours to have conversations with people, but we will keep our response is limited to fairly general things. We won't actually review application materials and give pointers on it. We can settle concerns that somebody has with how to interpret something, those sorts of answers. But we can't meet with people beforehand to really get into the specifics of an application.
Okay, and I actually just brought up the slide that has both of your contact information here for those watching, and we, as Tracy said at the beginning, this entire slide deck and the video portion of this program will be available on our website, so if they do have questions, they can reach out to you. We had someone else ask a more general question, which is if a potential applicant is looking for grant writing assistance, where can they turn? And you can respond to that. I also would want to point out we actually did a webinar just a few weeks ago that was put on by Ron Flavin with Intertribe, which is a native-owned company, talking specifically about different funding options and grant applications. We're also looking at doing a related program, or different program, but on a related topic after the first of the year. But when you get those questions at USDA, what's your answer as far as where potential applicants can go to get grant writing assistance?
We can't really make those sorts of recommendations. We have to stay impartial to that, so it would really be up to them to conduct their search. We don't have any requirement that they use a grant writer at all, but if they were looking to engage somebody, they would have to do that research on their own. We can't make those sorts of introductions.
Yeah, okay. And then a specific question, going back to the issue of the matching funds, and the question is, can unrecovered F&A facilities and administrative costs be considered a cash match?
No.
No, I mean, for the purposes of Community Connect, we're talking about cash.
Right.
So I guess I'm not entirely clear on what that means, but we're looking for cash set aside for the purposes of of the Community Connect project.
Okay.
That
and then we've got
applies to the DLT project too. We're looking for a 15% cash match, and if you have in-kind match on the leveraging to increase your points for the leveraging, it has to be like specific equipment that's going to be donated.
New non-depreciated.
okay.
Right.
And we've got quite a few attendees who have asked related questions, and the first one is about the 2014 DLT awards. Have those been announced, Randall?
The 2014 DLT awards?
That's correct.
They haven't been announced yet, but we expect them to be announced pretty soon here, though.
Okay. And then someone else asked if prior years' successful applications are available, either are they publicly available or are they available through information requests?
They would have to be there'd have to be a 4-year request to get those applications.
Okay. And then a few specific questions on the DLT. The first one here is has to do with the definition of teachers and students. And the question is, would an organization such as 4-H qualify? In other words, would that be considered, a teacher-student use? And in the world of 501c3 and nonprofit organizations, we would make the distinction between a formal educational organization versus a public education organization. Can you speak to that, Randall?
Well, on the 4-H side, I mean, as long as they meet the criteria for the applications, I don't see why that would be restricted. But you would have to have like a hub site for the teaching environment, and then you'd have to have an insight for students to use, or whoever who's going to use those in the community facilities. On the other question, you would have to document how you were going to, what your legal eligibility was when you were applied, and as long as you were legally eligible according to the criteria, there would be no restriction.
Okay. How about a related question, actually for both programs, asking about institutions of higher learning? So in this context, like a tribal college or university.
Well, for the purposes of Community Connect, most entity types that are not individuals or partnerships are eligible, but they would need to have the capacity to operate a broadband system that's available to the public, and I imagine that could be problematic for a lot of universities or other similar institutions. So it's not something that would be forbidden, but I can see that there would potentially be some stumbling blocks depending on the organization and what they're allowed to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Randall, anything to add to that on DLT?
Well, on the DLT side, as long as they are a legal entity and they fit the definition and they apply, they meet the criteria for the application, I don't see any restrictions on that.
Okay. And then Scott, here's another question on Community Connect that relates to the purposes for which they can apply. The question is, can you submit a Community Connect grant for the purpose of building or operating a community center if broadband is available in the area but not affordable by the community residents?
No. The community center has to be within an eligible PFSA that you're applying for, and one of the criteria for an eligible proposed funded service area is that broadband service can't be available there. And so we don't count satellite, it has to be a terrestrial service, and we don't count private circuits like T1s, T3s, that kind of thing. But any other technology type that's at more than 3 megabits per second will disqualify an area. And we can't just do the community center.
Okay, and so it's strictly based on service not being available, physically not available. It's not based on affordability.
That's correct. And remember, the community center is only part of the project. The other part is also building out and operating a broadband system. And so that question is also problematic from that perspective. It's not just the community center. Okay.
And then, Randall, a somewhat related question, or similar question with the DLT program, as far as what can be funded with that. And so the question is, could a rural eligible hospital apply for a telemedicine equipment unit if it already has one unit already in place? And it says, for example, if it needs more equipment but already has some equipment, but it can demonstrate a need for more, would that be eligible under the DLT program?
Yes, absolutely. That would be eligible. They can apply if they already have an existing unit and they have a need for more. They can certainly submit an application.
Okay. And then we've got actually quite a few additional questions that have come in relating to the process. So let's spend the remaining minutes, I guess, focusing really on that. The first question is if you've got a, if there is a time frame in terms of when you would be providing the notice for the 2015, I guess that would be under the Community Connect, right?
That's the one that's going to be coming the soonest. So we're looking at it being a notice of solicitation of applications, so there won't be a definitive amount of dollars available under the program known at that time. We're looking for that being published in the Federal Register quite soon, within the next few weeks. We're looking at a 60-day application window, so that would put applications due into here early in calendar year 2015. And DLT, I don't think it's a little bit further out. They're looking for the publication of a NOSA in early 2015. That's a little bit more cloudy at this point.
Okay. And you do anticipate that the awards for 2014 would be announced prior to issuing the notice for 2015. That's correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
The announcement should be soon.
Okay. A couple of questions that came in asking for some clarification, and so the first one, Scott, the question is if you could just kind of go over again what does not qualify as broadband service.
Oh, okay. So it's any terrestrial technology that's broadly available in an area that provides service at 3 megabits per second or higher. So like 4G cellular technology does count. Private circuit, T1, T3 doesn't count. Cable modem, fiber to the home service, all of those types of things that are broadly available in an area, those count. Anything 3 megabits per second or higher, including cellular.
Okay. And then Randall, a follow-up question about this. You know, if they have equipment already in place and they're submitting a request, you know, to fund for additional equipment, the follow-up question is, can a previous DLT awardee reapply, or is there some time period that they have to wait before applying to expand or bring on additional equipment?
No, there's no time frame. They can apply, you know, in any year they want to, any year the funding is available. They can go ahead and apply.
Okay. And then I've got a couple minutes left here, and I've got a couple additional questions that come in. So this one is also asking for some clarification, how the points for multiple endpoints are averaged to get to the rural points.
Yeah, there is a reality worksheet that's submitted with the application, and they simply list the end sites where the equipment is going to be located, and the population of that area where the end site is going to be located, and each one is given a relative score, and then they're simply added up, and the total points are added up and then divided by the number of end sites that they're using to get an average. And that's how their reality score is determined.
Okay. Here's a related question, but actually a lot more specific. It says if we have 4 endpoints, 3 of which are rural or exceptionally rural, and 1 which is considered urban, how would those points be added or averaged?
Well, the one that is urban, if it's over 20,000, would just simply get get 0 points. But they'll just add the other end sites, total those up, and then if there's 3 other ones and you got 4 total, then you simply add them all up and divide by 4.
Okay. And then this question also relates to the application process. And the question is, in previous applications for DLT, USDA staff have recommended hard copy applications because of the massive instructions for reassembling the application within the tabs system. So if one were to attempt to apply through grants.gov, can the tab section be uploaded as specified, or are you still recommending that they provide hard copy applications?
Well, they can apply either way. If they apply in grants.gov, then I think the sections that are uploaded or designated in the lettering sequence that's used in the hard copies, the D, E, and F, I believe it is. So, and once they're printed out here, they're simply separated according to their tab location.
Okay. And it looks like that we are able to cover all of the questions. And again, Scott and Randall, thank you very much for taking time today to cover a lot of very important material in a very short amount of time. And we just really appreciate your participating on the webinar today. So I want to take just the last minute that we have and talk briefly about the Tribal Telecom and Technology Conference. It's coming up May 4th through 7th, 2015 at the Hotel Albuquerque at Old Town Albuquerque. In New Mexico, we'll have a golf tournament on Monday, May 4th at Isleta Golf Course, and then the formal conference on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We've got quite a bit of information up on the website, including information about our keynote speakers and the program. And that website, again, is TribalTelecomConference.com. We've got one webinar right now scheduled for December, and that's Monday, December 15th. That's going to be on FirstNet's request for input on the development of a nationwide first responder network, what tribes need to know. We're going to have Carl Rebstock and Eli Vinendale from FirstNet, and then also Brian Tagaban with Navajo Nation Telecom Regulatory Commission, and Jim Dunstan, who's a telecom regulatory attorney in D.C., that will be presenting that webinar. We are also waiting for final confirmation on a date for a second webinar, which we'll be announcing in the next few days. And then, as we said at the beginning, the archived webinars are available on the website, and this program will also be uploaded within the next 24 hours. And you can find those at TribalTelecomConference.com/webinars. And we again thank you for participating on today's program and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.